Airports never sleep. There are always lights on, voices over the intercom, and the constant sound of luggage rolling across the marble floor. But there's something different about Denver International Airport in the dead of night. Something that sends chills down your spine, even when there's no clear reason why. Daniel felt at the moment he passed through security. It was his first night shift. The pay was good, and the expectations were minimal. Patrol empty hallways, check doors, and make sure no one was where they shouldn't be. Easy work. Or at least, that's what he thought. The supervisor, a thin, graying man named Russell, was waiting for him in the security office. He didn't smile when he saw Daniel, just handed him a badge and a folded piece of paper. Welcome to the night shift. Read this before you start. Daniel unfolded the paper. It was a list of rules. Some made sense, like always respond to the radio and don't let passengers stay in the boarding area without a ticket. But others were strange. 1. Don't look directly at the security cameras at gate C-17. 2. If you hear someone crying in the men's bathroom in the West Terminal, ignore it and keep walking. 3. The last flight of the night never has a destination. Don't try to figure out where it's going. 4. Gate 105 in the basement should never be opened. Never. Daniel frowned. Is this some kind of joke? Russell sighed. Don't ask. Just follow the rules. And with that, he left the room, leaving Daniel alone. The first few hours were easy. He walked through the brightly lit hallways, observing the few passengers still around. Most were exhausted people waiting for their connecting flights. Everything seemed normal until he noticed something strange. The cameras at gate C-17 were pointed at empty spots. None of them were filming passengers or the service counters. Daniel remembered the rule. Don't look directly at the cameras. But what could be wrong with that? He hesitated and then looked. On the security monitor, he saw himself standing there. But something was off. The image was slightly shaky, and his version on the screen was smiling. He wasn't smiling. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, the radio on his belt crackled with static. You've looked. They already know. The voice wasn't anyone he recognized. It seemed to come from very, very far away. Daniel spun around quickly, his heart racing. But the hallway behind him was empty. The first night of work was just beginning. Daniel felt cold sweat trickle down his neck. The radio in his hand still buzzed faintly with interference, but now it was silent. He looked back at the monitor, and his image was still there, static, motionless, but with that subtle, wrong smile. A shiver ran through his body. He blinked, and the distorted version of him on the screen blinked at the same time. Dropping the radio, he stepped away from the monitor. It must have been a system glitch. Some interference. Yeah, that had to be it. After all, airports are full of electronics, satellites, control towers. But then why did he feel a knot in his stomach, like something was watching him? Daniel shook his head and tried to ignore the feeling. He grabbed the radio again and walked away from the security room. Better to keep up with the rounds. Better to follow the rules. He crossed the terminal, his footsteps echoing on the shiny floor. At this hour, the airport was almost empty. Some passengers were asleep on the uncomfortable benches. Others stared at their phones with tired faces. But there was something off. At the end of the hallway, near the men's restroom in the West Terminal, Daniel heard a sound that shouldn't have been there. Someone was crying. The memory of the rules list made his stomach turn. If you hear someone cry in the men's restroom in the West Terminal, ignore it and keep walking. But it was hard to ignore. The crying was faint, almost childlike, but full of desperation. Daniel stopped in front of the restroom door. The fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows on the floor. Is someone in there? He called, his voice trembling more than he'd like. The crying stopped. Absolute silence. Daniel held his breath. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, something moved inside. Slow, dragging footsteps. The doorknob turned. He instinctively stepped back. The door opened just a crack, enough for a cold breeze to escape from inside. "You broke a rule," said a weak, distorted voice. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He didn't wait to see what was inside. He turned and walked quickly, almost running, without looking back. When he reached the main hall, the airport seemed normal again. The distant noise of an announcement, the sound of suitcases being dragged, an attendant yawning behind the counter. He tried to compose himself, calming his breath. But when he opened the locker in the employee break room, he found something that hadn't been there before. A small folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, he unfolded it and read the words written in black ink. "Leave while you can. They already know you're here." Daniel's blood ran cold. He felt a strong chill run up his spine. He looked around, but the break room was empty. Then, the radio crackled again. "You looked. Now, they're looking at you." Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to believe it was some kind of sick prank, but deep down he already knew it wasn't. Something was very, very wrong with this airport, and he wasn't sure if he'd be able to get out of there. The note burned in Daniel's hands. His heart pounded, hammering against his chest. He looked around, trying to find a co-worker who might have left it there. But the break room was completely empty. Then, the radio crackled once more. "You looked. Now, they're looking at you." The same voice. Cold, distant, almost mechanical. Daniel reached for the radio and pressed a button to respond, but hesitated. What would he say? Who are you? What's going on? Is this a prank? None of those options seemed helpful. None would explain the chill running up his spine. Dropping the note, he left the break room and quickly walked down the corridor in the administrative area. The echo of his footsteps sounded louder than it should have. He needed to find Russell. He was the supervisor. Maybe he could clear up what the hell was happening. But as he turned the corner, Daniel stopped suddenly. The lights were flickering, and at the end of the hallway, in front of a security monitor built into the wall, there was a man standing with his back to him. He wore a uniform identical to Daniel's. Same cap, same badge hanging from the pocket. But what made him hold his breath was the reflection on the screen. The man had no face. The smooth surface of skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been sent a visceral chill through Daniel. Then, the man turned his head toward him. Daniel ran. His lungs burned as he raced through the hallways, turning corners aimlessly, driven only by the instinct to survive. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to escape. Suddenly, his shoulder slammed into a metal door. He tried to turn the doorknob, locked. But when he looked up, he saw a sign. Access to sublevel. Authorized personnel only. Daniel knew he shouldn't go down. But when he heard slow, dragging footsteps echoing to the hallway behind him, he realized he had no choice. He looked around and found an access card hanging from the pocket of a lab coat left on a chair. He didn't have time to think about who it might belong to. He swiped the card on the reader. The light turned green. The door opened with a muffled creak. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. The only thing waiting for him, inside, was a flight of stairs descending into absolute darkness. And somehow, Daniel knew he was about to uncover the true secret of Denver Airport. He took a deep breath and began to descend. The door slammed shut behind Daniel with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the cold, narrow staircase, plunging him into suffocating silence. The only sound now was his own breath and the rustling of his feet on the concrete steps. The airport's underground. He'd never heard of this floor. Would any other employee know about it? A flickering fluorescent light buzzed on the ceiling, casting a sickly greenish glow. The smell of dampness was strong. The walls had water stains, as if this hallway hadn't been used in a long time. But what made him feel most uneasy were the doors. Both sides of the corridor were lined with identical heavy steel doors, all numbered irregularly, A12, B07, C34, as if there was no logical sequence. Some were open, revealing empty, abandoned rooms. Others had large, rusted locks. But one door caught his attention. Door 105. It was one of the rules. Door 105 in the basement should never be opened. Never. Daniel took a step back, his stomach churning. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to know what was behind that door. But it was when he turned to go back that he realized. The staircase was gone. Panic surged up Daniel's throat like a muffled scream. He spun on his heels, searching for the exit. But the place where the staircase should have been was now just a concrete wall with no markings. "This can't be happening," he murmured, feeling his hands grow cold. The radio on his belt crackled. "You've descended. Now, you must keep going." The voice. That same distorted voice. Daniel tried to ignore it, focusing on keeping his breath steady. He needed to find another way out. Anything. That's when he heard it. A faint, dragging sound, like something moving on the other side of door 105. No, he wasn't going to open it, but the sound intensified. Now it seemed closer. Something was lightly tapping on the door. Heavy breathing could be heard through the gap at the bottom. Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding. Then, the voice came from behind the door. Daniel, his name. His muscles froze. How did it know his name? The breathing on the other side of the door grew louder. Now, it seemed multiple, like there were more than one person inside. And then a low, rasping whisper came through the lock. "You've been here before." The door began to shake. Daniel spun on his heels and ran. The lights flickered as he dashed down the corridor, turning right, then left, trying to find an exit. But no matter how many doors he passed, the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly. He began to feel like he was walking in circles, like the very space around him was folding in on itself, until, without warning, he bumped into something, or someone. Daniel fell to the ground, gasping for air. He looked up, already expecting to see something horrific, some twisted creature, or one of the shadows that had been chasing him since the beginning of his shift. But no, it was Russell. The supervisor stood over him, his face serious. "You shouldn't be here, kid." Daniel didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. But one thing was certain. Something in that airport wanted to keep him there, and he needed to get out before it was too late. Daniel blinked several times, trying to make sure Russell was real. After everything he had seen, the monitors, door 105, the voice that knew his name, nothing seemed trustworthy anymore. The supervisor reached out his hand to help him up. "You broke the rules, kid." Russell's tone wasn't angry, but something worse, disappointment. Like Daniel had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. What's going on here?" Daniel's voice trembled. "This place, this floor. I've seen things, Russell. Things that shouldn't exist." The supervisor sighed, as if he had heard this conversation many times before. "Listen, kid. It doesn't matter what you saw or heard. What matters is getting out of here now. If it's still possible." Daniel shuddered. "What do you mean by if it's still possible?" Russell didn't answer. Instead, he started walking down the hallway. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but followed the supervisor. They walked in silence. The corridor seemed less distorted now, as if Russell's presence was stabilizing the space around them. But then, he stopped in front of a new door. Unlike the others, this one was solid pitch black, with no visible doorknob or lock. Something about its surface seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Above it, a lit sign read, "Sector X, Restricted Access." Russell looked at Daniel, his eyes dark. "Do you want to know what's beneath Denver Airport?" Daniel swallowed hard. And then, Russell pushed the door open. What Daniel saw didn't make sense. The door opened to a gigantic hall, much larger than should be physically possible beneath the airport. The ceiling was vaulted, filled with strange symbols glowing in a faint golden hue, almost as if they were written into reality itself. The walls were coated with a black, organic substance, something between stone and living flesh. And in the center of the room, something was pulsating, a massive structure resembling a colossal heart, covered in cables, wires, and metal tubes that seemed to keep it running. It was beating. Thump, thump, thump. Daniel staggered back. "What is this?" he shouted. Russell didn't answer immediately. He just watched, grim. What keeps this place running? What makes this airport different from any other in the world? Daniel felt bile rise in his throat. Is it alive? Russell looked at him. If you're asking that, then you already know the answer. Before Daniel could say anything, something moved in the hall. On the other side, silhouettes began to emerge. They were human, but wrong. They wore airport employee uniforms, like Daniel and Russell's, but they had no faces, just smooth skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. They moved in perfect synchrony, slowly advancing. Daniel's radio crackled. "They know you're here." Russell pulled something from his uniform pocket, a red badge with a strange symbol. "This is going to get us out of here, but you need to trust me." Daniel looked at the faceless workers. They were getting closer. He had no choice. When Russell swiped the badge on a nearby panel, the room shook. The black door behind them began to close by itself. The faceless workers ran, but before they could reach them, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Daniel collapsed on the floor, struggling to breathe. Russell looked at him. "Now you understand, kid." But Daniel didn't understand anything, and he felt like he hadn't seen the worst of it yet. The silence after the door closed was deafening. Daniel could still feel his heart racing, his lungs burning, sweat dripping down his forehead. Those faceless workers, the pulsating heart in the underground, the strange rules. None of it made sense. Russell watched him with a serious look. "You weren't supposed to know this, Daniel. Now that you have, things are going to get a lot harder for you. Tell me the truth, Russell." Daniel shouted, his nerves on edge. "What is this place? What's really going on here?" Russell ran a hand over his face, looking exhausted. "Denver Airport. It's not just an airport." He paused, staring directly at Daniel. "It's a facade." Daniel felt his stomach turn. A facade for what? Russell took a deep breath before responding. For something much older than you can imagine. Russell started walking, and Daniel followed him, even though he wasn't sure if he trusted him. The corridors were different now. There were no more numbered doors or concrete walls. They were steel tunnels, with thick cables running across the ceiling and floor. Daniel realized they were going down. He didn't ask where they were going. He had a feeling that if he did, he wouldn't like the answer. After a few minutes, they arrived at a massive elevator. It was industrial, with metal grates and worn-out buttons. Russell pulled a card from his pocket and swiped it through a reader. The door opened. Daniel hesitated before stepping in. "What's down there?" Russell stared at him. The truth. The elevator descended. When the doors opened, Daniel held his breath. Before them was an underground horizon, an immense space that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. The ceiling was made of a dark, opaque material, like stone mixed with something organic. Metal structures rose from the ground, connected by cables glowing in a pale blue hue. But the worst part were the people. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, working, moving boxes, operating machines. But something was wrong. Their movements were mechanical, too synchronized. And as Daniel stepped a little closer, he realized why. They had no eyes. Or rather, they had eyes, but not where they should have been. Each of those workers had their eyes sewn into the palms of their hands. Daniel choked. What are these people?" Russell clenched his fists. "They were like you." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. "What do you mean?" The supervisor looked at him, and for the first time, Daniel saw fear in Russell's eyes. People who broke the rules. Daniel felt like he was going to vomit. He wanted to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. Then the light changed. An alarm began to blare. The eyeless workers stopped what they were doing. They turned at the same time, and they pointed their hands at Daniel. "Shit," Russell muttered. The elevator behind them shut off. Daniel felt desperation rising. "What's happening?" Russell grabbed his shoulder firmly. "They know you're here. And now, you have to choose. Choose what?" Russell took a deep breath. "Either you join them," he pulled something from his pocket. It was a golden badge. "Or you come with me, but you'll never leave this airport." Daniel felt the blood freeze in his veins. The workers began to move. He had only a few seconds, and he needed to choose. The underground air felt thicker, heavy with an almost tangible weight. The workers without eyes moved closer, moving in perfect sync, as if controlled by an invisible force. Daniel could feel the tension building in his chest. The room's lights flickered, and the cables connecting the machines seemed to vibrate, emitting a nearly imperceptible sound, like a distant whisper. Russell held the golden badge firmly, staring intently at Daniel. His face was tense, and his eyes were filled with a quiet fear, the same fear Daniel was now feeling. "You can't go back, Daniel," Russell said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You've seen more than you should. They know you're here, but I know too. I've seen others before you." The workers kept moving closer, their hands raised, their stitched eyes staring into the void. Daniel's heart raced uncontrollably. What was he supposed to do? Go with Russell and become part of this strange, unsustainable reality? Or surrender to them, the soulless eyes, the machine that seemed to consume everything around? "Make your choice quickly," Russell said. "You don't have much time." It was as if the walls were starting to close in. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the feeling of being watched grew more intense with every passing second. Daniel looked at the golden badge. He thought about his life before all this, a simple worker, an ordinary man, a lost tourist among the mysteries of that airport. What he was about to decide could be the end of everything, or a chance to start over. Suddenly, a laugh echoed through the room, low and distorted. It wasn't Russell. It was something much deeper, something ancient. The ground trembled. Daniel looked at the workers, their hands outstretched. Something wasn't right. What he didn't know yet was that the choice wasn't between going up or staying. He was no longer part of this world, no matter what he decided. The elevator door slammed shut, but the laugh kept going, now at an unbearable volume, filling his mind with an unbroken echo. The stitched eyes in the workers' hands began to glow, and in one swift movement, they all crouched down, touching the ground with their palms facing down. Daniel swallowed hard. Russell was silent now, his eyes locked on the badge Daniel was holding. It felt like he was about to be consumed by something far greater than reality itself. "No, don't leave me," Russell murmured, his body starting to tremble. "You don't understand, Daniel. This was meant to happen. You were already marked." The ground began to crack, a bright, intense light emerging from the fissures, enveloping both of them. The air became heavy, suffocating. Daniel felt a presence, something alien, beyond his understanding, drawing closer to him. That's when he understood. The choice wasn't his. None of this was real. Denver International Airport was just a link between two dimensions, a passage, a prison. The light grew, swallowing everything around them. And when Daniel looked at Russell for the last time, he saw his face contorting, his eyes beginning to stitch into the palms of his hands as he murmured, "Welcome to the real airport." Everything went dark, and the next day, when the sun rose over Denver, the news began to spread. A new mysterious disappearance had occurred at Denver International Airport, but no one would ever understand what had really happened there, where the line between the normal and the impossible blurred, and the city beneath the city kept on living, waiting for the next curious soul to cross its gates.